Harlow stepped onto the campus, the weight of the world pressing down on him. The air was thick with possibility, but it tasted bitter, like the expectation that he would never belong here. His eyes scanned the towering buildings of the university, places of power, of knowledge, but also of rejection. His heart pounded as he clutched his backpack tightly. He wasn't just carrying his books, he was carrying the hopes of everyone who had ever doubted him. The first glance he caught was enough to confirm the truth. Whispers followed him like shadows. His black skin, his presence, his ambition, everything about him felt out of place to those who had already claimed this world as their own. He pushed forward, determined not to let their stares break him, even as the first subtle signs of discrimination appeared. He didn't belong here, not in their eyes, but he would fight for his place. And then he saw him. Professor Caldwell, the one who would hold his future in his hands. The man stood at the front of a lecture hall, his smug gaze already sweeping over the room, his expression one of disapproval as his eyes landed on Harlow. There it was, the flicker of disdain, the feeling of being less than capable, less than worthy. It was the same look Harlow had received his whole life, but this time it didn't break him. This time he would show them. He wasn't just here to study, he was here to rise. The lecture hall was a sea of faces, but Harlow felt isolated, a lone figure adrift in the current. Professor Caldwell stood at the front, his presence commanding the room with a silent arrogance. It wasn't just the way he spoke, but the way he looked at people. He saw them not as students, but as categories, labels he had long since sealed into neat little boxes. Harlow couldn't shake the feeling that he was nothing more than a curiosity to the professor. His every move felt under scrutiny. His every word weighed with suspicion. It wasn't long before he saw it. The barely concealed sneer in Caldwell's eyes when he called on him. The dismissive flick of his hand when Harlow spoke. Harlow could feel the weight of those looks, 1,000 small barbs that dug deep, even though no words were spoken. Each day felt like a battle against the belief that he was inferior, that his dreams were too big for this world. But deep within him, a fire burned brighter with every insult, every glance. He wasn't just going to prove the professor wrong. He was going to make them all see. This world would not break him. It would not define him. As the lecture ended, Harlow felt a new resolve building inside him. This was just the beginning. The days blurred together, each one a mirror of the last. Harlow's footsteps echoed through the campus, yet he felt invisible. The whispers behind his back, the sideways glances, the subtle barriers, they were all a part of the unspoken code he'd have to break. Every encounter with Professor Caldwell felt like another stone added to the wall between them, a wall built on nothing but prejudice and pride. But Harlow was different. He didn't let the whispers consume him. Instead, he channeled them, turning every snide glance into fuel for his fire. Late nights in the library, pages of research filled with his thoughts, with his brilliance. No one would see it now, but Harlow was already shaping his destiny. Every word, every equation, every idea, he carved his name into the future without them even knowing it. His mind raced, each thought a promise to himself. He would not be the stereotype they painted. He would not shrink into the background, invisible and unheard. This was his time to rise, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been overlooked or underestimated. The weight of the world felt heavy, but his shoulders stood strong, unyielding. With each day that passed, Harlow knew the road ahead would be long and unforgiving. But he was ready, ready to show them all who he really was. The world would not define him. He would define his own future. The room was silent, save for the soft murmur of the air conditioning, but Harlow could feel every eye on him. Professor Caldwell's gaze was sharp, cold, as he paced the front of the lecture hall, his steps heavy with unspoken judgment. Harlow's thoughts raced, but he forced himself to focus, tuning out the tension that gripped the air. It didn't matter how much he knew or how hard he worked. Today, in front of these people, he was still just another black student, a token in a room full of expectations and assumptions. As Professor Caldwell's eyes lingered on him, Harlow's heart pounded, his chest tightening with each passing second. He wasn't just a student in this moment. He was the subject of an unspoken test, a challenge that he had not chosen but had to face nonetheless. The professor spoke, his voice laced with thinly veiled mockery. Harlow could feel it, the way his presence was scrutinized, diminished. It was all too familiar, a reminder of how the world often saw him. But today was different. This time he wouldn't shrink. This time he would rise above the weight of the professor's disdain, the walls of their expectations. His mind sharpened, his resolve hardening like steel. Days passed, each one a relentless repetition of the last. The same stares, the same subtle dismissals. Harlow could feel the walls closing in, his presence barely acknowledged except for the occasional glance of judgment. But within him, something began to shift, something that grew stronger with each passing day. It wasn't the whispers or the glances that defined him. It was the quiet fire he had nurtured, the one that refused to burn out. When Harlow sat alone in the library, surrounded by stacks of books, he wasn't just studying, he was building a foundation. He was crafting a future no one could take from him. In the midst of this storm, a hand reached out. Kara, a classmate who had watched him from afar, saw beyond the surface. She wasn't like the others, hesitant and unsure. She saw the brilliance in him, the quiet strength that no one else cared to notice. Her support, though silent, felt like the first spark of warmth in a long, cold winter. With her encouragement, Harlow started to believe again, not just in his intelligence but in the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he could change the way the world saw him. It was a flicker, fragile yet bright enough to see. And in that moment, he knew that he was no longer alone. The fight had just begun, but now he had a reason to win. The weight of the world seemed lighter today, as if the air had shifted just enough to breathe again. Harlow stood on the edge of a decision, one that would shape the path ahead. His mind buzzed with the possibilities, the risks, and the undeniable urge to prove himself. He had been humiliated, overlooked, and dismissed. But now he had a choice. He could remain in the shadows, a silent observer, or he could step forward, fearless, and carve his own place in the sun. The competition was the opportunity he had been waiting for, a chance to showcase his work to the world. But more than that, it was a chance to show everyone who had doubted him, who had overlooked him, that their expectations were irrelevant. He wasn't here to follow the rules they had set. He was here to break them. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, his thoughts racing. Doubts flickered like fleeting shadows. Was it worth the risk? But then, he remembered the fire that had burned within him since day one, the one that refused to be extinguished. With a steady breath, he clicked submit. This was his moment, his chance to be more than the labels others had placed on him, No longer would he be the student who blended into the background. He would stand tall, proud of the person he was becoming. This was only the beginning. The nights grew longer, and the weight of the task ahead began to settle into Harlow's bones. Each hour felt stretched, an endless loop of research, experimentation, and notes. The world around him seemed to blur, the bustling campus fading into the background as he buried himself deeper into his work. His mind never stopped racing, ideas pouring in faster than he could write them down. Despite the pressure, despite the fatigue creeping in from every angle, he felt a strange sense of peace. This was what he had been waiting for, what had been building inside him all along. The world had underestimated him, ignored him, but now it would have no choice but to pay attention. Every calculation, every theory he developed felt like a step toward something much bigger than just this competition. It was the beginning of a future he would control, not one shaped by prejudice or assumptions. Yet it wasn't just the work itself that kept him going. It was the quiet determination in his heart, the relentless voice that told him failure was not an option. Each night, as the clock ticked into the early hours, Harlow worked without hesitation, pushing past the doubts that lingered like shadows. He could feel the change now, not just in the world around him, but in himself. His resolve had hardened. With every hour, he was becoming someone he never imagined, someone capable of greatness, someone who would no longer be ignored. The days leading up to the competition felt like a blur, each one a mix of intense focus and quiet tension. Harlow's project was almost ready, his research polished and refined, each piece of the puzzle fitting together perfectly. But as he entered the lecture hall that morning, something in the air felt off, like an unspoken challenge was hanging there, waiting. Professor Caldwell's eyes met his from across the room, and for a moment, Harlow felt a chill crawl down his spine. It wasn't the usual condescending look. This one was sharper, more deliberate. Harlow tried to shake off the feeling as he set his notes down, preparing to present in front of the class. But as the professor began to speak, a subtle, dangerous undertone seeped into his words. Caldwell dismissed Harlow's project with a flick of his hand, questioning its validity and dismissing the conclusions. It wasn't just criticism, it was an attack, calculated and cold. He undermined every piece of Harlow's work, casting doubt on its credibility, all the while casting a shadow over his achievement. But instead of shrinking back, something within Harlow snapped. The professor's words didn't break him, they fueled him. He had always known the road would be hard, but this was a challenge he could face. He wasn't just proving his intelligence, he was proving his resilience. This moment wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a fight he was determined to win. Harlow's mind raced in the silence of the night, the hum of the campus a distant echo as he sat alone in the library. His work, his passion, felt like it was slipping through his fingers. Professor Caldwell's criticism had stung, leaving an ache in his chest that he couldn't shake. Yet even as doubt crept in, another feeling emerged, something stronger, fiercer. The late-night silence became a companion as Harlow pored over his project once more. Every line of code, every theory, every hypothesis. He knew the professor's words were meant to break him, but instead, they had ignited something within. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of realization. This wasn't about just proving his intelligence. This was about proving something deeper, his worth. Not to Caldwell, not to anyone, but to himself. Every test, every challenge, every insult had led him here. This wasn't a story about revenge. It was a story about redemption, about proving that no matter how many times the world tries to push you down, you can always rise again. With a steady breath, Harlow refocused, recalculated, and with unwavering determination, he pushed forward. The path wasn't easy, but it had never been clearer. This moment wasn't just a test of his intellect. It was a test of his heart. And he wasn't about to fail. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the campus as Harlow sat in the corner of the library, the faint rustle of pages the only sound that kept him company. Hours turned into days, each one filled with relentless focus, the weight of the competition heavy on his shoulders. Yet, with every challenge, every barrier placed in front of him, something within Harlow grew stronger. The world around him continued to push him aside, dismissing his worth, his potential, as though it were an afterthought. But Harlow was no longer concerned with their opinion. Their disregard was the fuel that kept his fire burning. Each glance, each critique, a reminder that he had something they would never understand: resilience. With a final keystroke, Harlow finished his work, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to exhale. The project was not just a culmination of hours of work. It was a declaration, a statement that he belonged here. Not because they said so, but because he earned it. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Harlow clicked submit without hesitation, knowing that the real victory wasn't in the award or recognition. It was in the fight he had fought, the journey he had undertaken. He had been underestimated, ignored, but now he was standing tall, knowing that he had already won. The rest was just a formality. The day of the competition arrived, the air crackling with anticipation, yet all was still in Harlow's world. The crowd, the nervous energy, the stakes, everything faded away as he stepped into the presentation room. It was just him and his work. He had faced countless obstacles to get here, each one a reminder of the odds stacked against him. But none of it mattered now. He had already crossed the hardest part of the journey. He had proven to himself that he could push beyond every limit they set for him. As he set up his presentation, Harlow didn't feel the weight of the eyes on him. There was only one thought that drove him forward. This was his moment, his story, his time to show the world what they had never believed he could be. His project spoke for itself. Each detail, each insight, his brilliance shone through with quiet intensity. When it was over, there were no grand gestures, no applause that could match the depth of what he had accomplished. His success wasn't measured in the reactions of others, but in the realization that he had stood up when the world had tried to knock him down. He had not only surpassed their expectations, he had surpassed his own. The room was silent as the judges deliberated, but Harlow was already victorious. He had already achieved something greater than any prize. He had proven that he belonged. The days dragged on after the competition, each one feeling heavier than the last. Harlow moved through the motions, his thoughts consumed by the weight. His presentation had been flawless, his hard work finally laid bare for everyone to see. Yet, despite the calm exterior, there was a storm brewing inside him. The uncertainty of the outcome gnawed at him, making every hour feel like an eternity. The campus buzzed with whispers, but Harlow couldn't bring himself to listen. The moment he had worked for was out of his hands now. He had done everything he could. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about something deeper, something that had shifted within him through every challenge he had faced. Days passed, and the noise around him grew louder. Others speculated about who would win, who would be recognized. Yet, in the midst of it all, Harlow found a strange sense of peace. No matter the result, he knew he had already achieved something invaluable. He had proven his worth, not to the world, but to himself. When the announcement finally came, it wasn't just a prize being awarded. It was the moment where everything he had fought for, every late night, every insult, every ounce of doubt, was finally justified. Harlow had become more than anyone had ever expected, and in that quiet victory, he realized the most important thing: he was unstoppable. The moment Harlow had been waiting for finally arrived, yet there was no overwhelming rush of excitement, no fanfare. Instead, it was quiet, a single step forward into a world that would never be the same. The announcement of the winner seemed distant, almost irrelevant in comparison to the journey that had led him here. His eyes wandered over the crowd, but there was no need for validation anymore. He had already proven himself. The competition, the struggles, the doubts, all of it had shaped him, each challenge carving a piece of his resolve into something stronger. As he accepted the recognition, Harlow realized it wasn't just about the acknowledgement of his brilliance. It was about the strength he had discovered within himself. The world around him had underestimated him, dismissed him. But in the quiet of that moment, it didn't matter. He had won, not because they had awarded him, but because he had earned it with every ounce of his being. He walked away from the stage not with a sense of triumph, but with an overwhelming sense of peace. The validation he had sought for so long wasn't external. It had always been inside him. And now, it was clear. No matter what the world threw at him, he would always rise. The journey was far from over, but Harlow was no longer the person who had walked in. He had become something greater than he had ever imagined, unstoppable, unshaken, and destined for more. Weeks passed in a blur, the echo of his victory slowly fading into the background of Harlow's mind. The world had shifted, but in the quiet of his thoughts, something deeper stirred. Recognition, though sweet, had never been his true goal. There was something more, something he had realized through the intense battle within himself. It wasn't about proving others wrong anymore. It was about redefining who he was, what he stood for. Harlow's life had always been a series of expectations placed on him by others. Labels, assumptions, barriers. But now they no longer held weight. He had broken free from them, and as the days passed, he felt himself shedding layers of doubt and fear, like an old skin. His intelligence, his resilience, those weren't the things that defined him. It was his ability to rise, time and time again, no matter what the world threw at him. With each passing day, the person who had walked in that door weeks ago, unsure and afraid, began to fade further away. He wasn't just a student anymore, not just someone who fought for recognition. He had become the embodiment of perseverance, of strength, of quiet power. And in that quiet transformation, Harlow knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The world hadn't seen anything yet. Time moved in subtle ways, like a river carving its path through stone. Harlow's days were no longer filled with the overwhelming weight of doubt or fear. He walked through life with quiet confidence, each step a reminder of the journey he had taken. But there was something deeper, something unspoken that lingered beneath the surface, a truth he had yet to fully grasp. The recognition, the validation, those things had never mattered to him in the way he once thought they would. The applause had faded, The eyes that once doubted him had turned away, and yet, in the silence, Harlow realized something more profound. It wasn't about the world's approval. It was about the quiet strength that now thrived within him. He wasn't the same person who had walked into the competition, uncertain and eager for approval. He had transformed, not because the world had finally seen him, but because he had finally seen himself. His worth was not defined by the accolades or the praise. It was defined by the strength to rise, to continue, to never stop moving forward, no matter the odds. The world had underestimated him at every turn, but now he understood something vital. The true victory wasn't in the acknowledgement he had sought, but in the realization that he had always been enough. And that was the power no one could ever take from him. Harlow's life had settled into a new rhythm, one marked by peace rather than the frantic energy that once consumed him. The world outside had moved on, its attention already shifting to the next big thing. But for Harlow, this was a moment of reflection. He had become something unshakable, not because of his intellect or his accomplishments, but because of the stillness within him. The quiet moments were where he found his true power. No longer driven by the need to prove himself, he began to understand that his strength wasn't found in external validation. It was within, the resilience to face challenges, the wisdom to grow from them, and the quiet confidence that nothing could ever take that from him. He didn't need the world's recognition. He had learned to stand tall even when no one was watching. The struggles had shaped him, the setbacks had hardened him, and now he stood as a testament to the quiet victories that no one could see. His journey wasn't about proving others wrong. It was about embracing who he had always been, someone capable of greatness, not because of the world's approval, but because of his own belief in himself. The future was his to shape. Life moved forward in subtle ways, each day blending into the next. Yet there was an undeniable shift in Harlow. He had shed his old self, the one burdened by the weight of doubt and the need for validation. Now, he walked through the world with a calm certainty, a quiet strength that wasn't boastful, but powerful. Every challenge that had once seemed insurmountable now felt like a mere ripple in a vast ocean. His mind, sharper than ever, was no longer consumed with proving his worth to others. It was focused on the endless possibilities before him. The world was vast, but he had learned one thing: his own potential was limitless. The peace he had found wasn't just in success or recognition. It was in the acceptance of who he truly was. Harlow no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. His value wasn't measured by grades or trophies, but by the quiet conviction that he was enough, that he always had been. As he stepped forward into the future, there were no doubts, no fears, just a deep, abiding trust in himself and the journey ahead. The world had no idea what it was about to witness. The days were no longer filled with uncertainty or the heavy weight of expectations. Harlow had reached a place of calm, where each decision felt deliberate and each step forward was made with quiet confidence. The world around him had moved on, chasing the next story, the next breakthrough. But for him, the true victory was in the stillness, the space where he had finally found himself. No longer was he driven by the need to impress or outdo others. The pressure that once clouded his every move had vanished. What remained was a person who no longer sought external validation, because he had long understood that his worth wasn't measured by the opinions of others, but by his own self-belief. Harlow's mind, sharp and focused, was no longer chasing after fleeting recognition. He had learned to embrace his power, to trust his instincts, and to let his actions speak louder than any words ever could. In the quiet moments of reflection, Harlow realized the journey had never been about winning or losing. It had been about discovering the strength within himself. And in that discovery, he had already triumphed. The campus felt different now, quieter, as if the hustle and bustle of the past months had faded into the background. Harlow moved through it all with ease, a presence that went unnoticed, yet spoke volumes. He no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. His path had been carved not by the opinions of others, but by his own quiet determination. As he walked across the familiar grounds, there was a new energy within him. The future didn't seem so daunting anymore. It was wide open, full of possibility, and for the first time, Harlow felt ready to embrace it. He had already proven the most important thing, that his worth wasn't defined by success or failure, but by the strength he carried inside. With each step, there was no looking back. The journey had transformed him, taught him that real power lay not in external validation, but in the quiet confidence that comes from self-acceptance. He was no longer the person who sought approval from the world. He was the person who trusted himself, who knew that nothing could stop him. The horizon ahead was vast, but Harlow was no longer afraid. He was ready for whatever came next. The days that followed felt like the calm after a storm, the kind of stillness that comes with knowing everything has changed. Harlow no longer looked for answers in the eyes of others. He had learned that the true path was one that he carved alone, with nothing but his own hands and heart guiding him forward. The weight of expectations had long since lifted, and in its place there was an overwhelming sense of freedom. It was as if the world, once so loud and demanding, had faded into the background, leaving only the clear sound of his own heartbeat to guide him. Harlow's steps were lighter now. He walked with a quiet grace, no longer burdened by the pressure to perform or prove. He had already done that. The strength he had sought from external sources was now firmly rooted within him, and it had changed everything. There was no fear of the unknown, no hesitation in the face of challenges. The road ahead, though uncharted, felt like a vast expanse of opportunity. And Harlow, more than ever, was ready to walk it, unafraid, unshaken, and unstoppable. Harlow had come to realize that his greatest victory wasn't the accolades, nor the recognition that once seemed so important. It was the quiet moments, the ones when the noise of the world faded, and all that remained was the clarity of his own mind. It was in these moments that he understood who he truly was, beyond the surface and beyond the judgment of others. His journey had been long, full of obstacles that seemed impossible to overcome. Yet here he stood, stronger than he had ever imagined. Each challenge, each setback, had only made him more determined. What the world hadn't seen, what they hadn't understood, was that Harlow's strength didn't come from external validation. It came from within, from the quiet resilience that no one could take away. As he moved forward, there was no rush. The path ahead wasn't a race. He had learned that everything worth achieving required time and patience. The true power lay in the ability to move steadily without the need to prove anything. The world might never fully understand him, but Harlow no longer cared. He knew his worth, and that was enough. Harlow walked through life with a quiet strength now, unshaken by the world's judgments. He no longer needed the applause or the recognition that once seemed to define his worth. There was something more powerful than external validation. The deep, unspoken understanding that he had finally become the person he was always meant to be. His mind, once consumed by doubts and the weight of expectations, now felt free, unburdened by the need to impress anyone. He moved with purpose, not rushing but fully aware of each step he took. His journey had been long, each day a reminder of how far he had come. What the world hadn't seen was the countless hours of hard work, the quiet moments of reflection, and the strength it took to rise after every fall. Harlow had discovered the truth, that true victory wasn't about what others saw, but what he saw in himself. The power to stand tall, to keep moving forward, was within him all along. He no longer chased approval. Instead, he embraced the journey, knowing that each step was a victory in itself. In this silence, Harlow found the greatest truth. He was enough. And that was all that mattered. Harlow stood at the edge of a new chapter, not of his life, but of his evolution. The weight of expectations had faded, replaced by a quiet but profound understanding that he no longer needed to prove himself to anyone. The world, with all its noise and demands, had receded to the background, and in its place, a sense of calm settled deep within him. Each day, he moved forward with a strength that didn't come from external forces. It came from within, quiet, unwavering, and unshakable. There were no grand gestures or dramatic moments. It was the subtle shift in how he carried himself, the steady confidence that now defined him. The hardest battles, Harlow had learned, were never fought in the world around him. They were fought inside. And in that silence, in the stillness of his own heart, he had won. He no longer needed validation or the world's approval. His strength came from the peace he had found within, the quiet knowledge that he was enough. The future was no longer a source of fear. It was an open canvas, and Harlow was ready to paint it with the lessons he had learned, the quiet victories that no one could ever take from him. Harlow's world had become quieter, not because of the silence around him, but because he had learned to tune out the noise within. The chaos, the doubts, the constant pressure to measure up, it all faded into the background. What remained was something far more valuable: clarity. He had learned that peace wasn't something to be sought, it was something to be embraced. Every decision he made now felt effortless, not because it was easy, but because he had stopped fighting against himself. He had learned to trust his own instincts, to follow the path that felt right, even when others couldn't understand it. In this newfound peace, Harlow felt a sense of freedom he had never known. The pursuit of success had once been a relentless chase, but now success felt like a quiet byproduct of living authentically. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, not even himself. He was simply being. And in that simple act of being, he had found the most powerful victory of all: the ability to stand firm in who he was, without needing to prove it to anyone. The future ahead was unwritten, but Harlow was ready to face it with the quiet strength of someone who had already won. Harlow had come to understand something powerful. Life wasn't about reaching a destination, but about learning to walk steadily through its ever-changing landscape. The world had not seen his struggles, his doubts, or the silent battles he had fought. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was how far he had come, how much he had grown, and how much peace he had found within himself. Every step forward was a quiet victory. Every day was a new chance to embrace who he was without apology. He had shed the layers of self-doubt and insecurity, stepping into the light of self-assurance. There was no applause for it, no recognition. It was simply the quiet strength that had become his foundation. The journey was never about the final chapter, he realized. It was about the moments, the quiet transformations that no one could see but him. And in those moments, Harlow had found something more valuable than success or fame. He had found himself. The story, as it always was still unfolding. But now Harlow didn't fear it. He walked forward with certainty, knowing that whatever came next, he was ready. His greatest victory was in knowing that the power to shape his own destiny had always been within him, and that was enough.